Hello. Welcome to the second installment of Books on Tour. I'm your host, Veronica Andrews, or hostess, whatever. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Todd Depastino, who's done a marvelous job on a book about Bill Mauldin. Your name might not be familiar, but the minute you see the cartoon of Willie and Joe from the Second World War, you will want to know this young man. Fascinating. How long did you have to research it?
It took me about 3 years.
Okay.
Well, 3 years to research and write.
Okay.
I spent about two and a half years researching, going around interviewing family members, friends, doing a lot of research at the Library of Congress and other archives, and then about 6 months to a year writing up and revising.
Did you meet him?
No, didn't get to meet him. In fact, I'm somewhat ashamed to say I didn't really know who he was.
Neither did I.
Till about a year before I started working on his biography. And I kind of, through serendipity, ran across some of his cartoons, became fascinated with him, and learned a little bit more about his story, tried to find a biography of him or some kind of more information of him, and there wasn't that much, and started to think about writing a book about him, because it's such an incredible story. And just at that time, he appeared in the news because he was dying, and this was the summer of 2002. So he was dying right about the time when I was discovering who he was.
So it sort of was a meshing, and as I remember, it was in a small community paper was his first article about someone in their community that was picked up by a more prestigious press.
Yes.
And thus picked up by national press.
You mean the story of
the original story of him being in the nursing home and where he was? And
yes, it was a sad and sordid decline. And I would only later learn how sad and sordid it was. He was an alcoholic, advanced Alzheimer's. He had scalded himself in a bathtub, and he was dying of those injuries. And he no longer recognized friends and family. And he was alone and silent in this nursing home. And one combat soldier from the Pacific War in World War II learned that he was in a nursing home and visited him and pinned a combat infantry badge on his pajamas, and his face just lit up, and he seemed to know what was going on.
Yeah.
He seemed to respond, and so a local newspaper columnist named Gordon Dillow in Orange County wrote an article about this and invited veterans to come visit Mauldin in the nursing home. And they came by the dozens a day. I mean, so many came, the nursing home staff had to turn them away.
But I thought it was interesting that while he was aware of the Vietnam War and the Korean War, he responded to the World War II veterans.
Yeah, that was, I mean, ever since I wrote the book, I've gotten to know a lot of World War II veterans.
And they carry the cartoon with them.
And many of them, and they also carry the memories of that time with them. I mean, these are people who are now the youngest or in their early 80s. And those 1 or 2 or 3 years they spent in the service, I think are the most enduring chapter of their lives. You don't forget it.
But they don't talk about it.
Many of them don't.
No. If you find someone who does, it usually means they weren't there.
That's what Mauldin always said. Mauldin, when he came home from the war, he said, you know the guys who haven't seen combat because they're the ones bragging about it in bars. The ones who are really there are silent.
And they don't. And yet they came and they thanked him.
Yes.
They told him what his...
They filed in. They thanked him. They brought their favorite clippings. They told them how much they appreciated his cartoons while they were overseas, and then a national syndicated columnist, Bob Greene, did a story on this and said, why don't you send Bill Mauldin a card if you are a veteran? And they came by the hundreds a week.
Oh, good.
Hundreds and hundreds. So many that the family couldn't even open them all. Overwhelming. So I opened up a lot of these letters for the first time, and they're really moving.
It mattered. But it wasn't funny. His cartoons were not funny.
You know, I think that they're fresh, they're edgy. I think they are funny, but there's a depth to them.
Who's laughing?
The first time I read his cartoons, I laughed. I opened up front his best-selling book of 1945, about 160 cartoons and about 50,000 words of text. And the cartoons, each cartoon seemed funny, but there was also something more to each cartoon.
Satirical humor.
And so I started it again. I started the book again and read it almost immediately in one sitting again. And the second time through, I didn't laugh. I started to understand there's an underlying sadness and a tragic tone to these cartoons. These are cartoons about loss, about the loss of the best years of their lives.
Innocence.
Yeah.
And to jump ahead, and we're going to go all over the place because he led such a fascinating life. Started out really hard in Appalachia, difficult birth, protected as a child, rickets, stunted growth. I mean, even even in the movie that he was in with Audie Murphy, he looked like he just got out of high school.
Yeah, he always looked much younger than he was.
And that really can be a detriment to you in regular life or in the Army. Responded to ROTC with its uniforms and its polish and everything, but always drew from Appalachia to there and always studied it.
Yes. Well, he grew up with many kind of debilities. One was he was odd-looking. He had stunted growth. He had rickets, even though he grew up in the desert Southwest in the mountains. He was sickly. He seemed to have something like tuberculosis, although I've never been able to track that down.
Didn't he have a Yahoo brother who had everything that he didn't?
He had a brother who looked like Gary Cooper and was 6 feet tall at age 14 and weighed 50 pounds more, and he could take apart and put together an auto engine blindfolded. Bill seemed to have no abilities except this odd ability to do whatever academic task he was given. I mean, this guy was a kind of freak of nature. He was reading novels at age 4. He was doing complicated math at age 5. And where he came from, in this kind of rural community, he was just considered an oddball. His older brother, who was considered the promising one of the family, was illiterate his whole life. But that didn't matter because he was strong enough to do all the ranching and farm work.
And everything. Yeah.
Bill was an oddball, and he was kind of derided and picked on a lot. One of his early memories is walking past a general store and seeing 2 ranchers sitting on a bench, and the one leans to the other and says, "If that was my kid, I'd drown him."
Yeah, but wasn't he feisty?
Yeah.
You couldn't put him down.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't let his size or his stature or whatever else the world thought of him. He knew who he was. And he was going to go where he wanted to go, which he did do.
Yes.
He was going to do what he wanted to do, which he did do.
Yes, he had a kind of unearthly ambition. He was feisty, I guess is the word for it. I mean, he always said he grew up picking more fights and losing all of them than anybody he knew. He was thin-skinned. He was touchy. He had this just visceral connection to anybody who was an underdog or anybody who was aggrieved or anybody who was slighted. He took offense really easily, and he always hit back. And he had this magnificent ability to hit back through humor and through his art.
And look at the doors that it opened up for others.
Yes.
And it showed the big, tall, handsome strangers of the world that you haven't got at all if this guy can pull off what he's pulled off.
Yeah.
He went to school. He got into a very prestigious and a good school where he was drawing, but he didn't like the rules.
Well,
and he didn't like the way the rules were adjudicated.
It was the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts, and he managed to get 1 year, 12 months there. He borrowed $300 from his grandparents, and it was all the money he had in the world. This is the Great Depression. But his grandmother was one of the few people who really believed in him, who really saw the potential to this strange character. Mauldin was a high school dropout. He went to the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts because they accepted high school dropouts. They never checked his transcripts. But one thing they insisted upon, and that is everybody was going to be a fine artist, a portrait painter, a sculptor. He knew from an early age he wanted to be a cartoonist, so he lied his way through those courses. But it was through the courses that he really did learn about life drawing from life. He learned about skeleture and how to be a pro, how to really draft and compose excellent drawings.
And then when he went to work for newspapers, and he took jobs as a copy boy, a janitor, a desk, at the end of the day, he would take the thrown away cartoons out of the wastebasket of the leading cartoonist of the day, take them home and
Yes.
study them. Not copy them, not play, but learn
Yes.
what made those people and their work special.
You know, Malcolm Gladwell in his new book, Outliers, talks about what makes those who achieve extraordinary success in their fields different from others. And one of them is the rule of 10,000 hours. Is you have to put in 10,000 hours of study and practice to really become a master at what you do. And Mauldin put those 10,000 hours in his childhood.
Learning.
And very early on, he studied other cartoonists. He studied other artists. And during that 1 year he spent in Chicago, he didn't make any money off of his drawings, but every night he would draft 10 original cartoons and pack them up and send them off to national magazines. He managed to get a few published in Arizona Highways. He said that, you know, $2 per cartoon paid for the postage for the whole year almost. But that's where he spent. He would not go to sleep at night until he drafted 10 quality original cartoons.
A discipline
It was
that nobody really taught him.
Yeah.
It was, and again, he looked like he was 17 years old.
And you know, that every day he received back 10 rejections. I mean, it was week after week, month after month of rejection, and he persisted. And it's incredible to me to think about persisting under those conditions.
Even his quest for paper,
Yeah.
ink,
Yeah.
brushes.
Yeah.
He didn't settle for 5 and time.
Right.
He didn't take whatever. He put himself in a place and in a position where only what he knew would reflect his work
Yes.
when he presented it, and,
Yes.
he would acquire it.
That kind of ingenuity served him really well in the war when he lands with the 45th Division in Sicily in the summer of 1943 and learns for the first time what combat is really like, decides, because he's just an infantryman himself, he's a rifleman who happens to draw these cartoons for the 45th Division News.
And his popularity wasn't really all that well known yet.
No, he wasn't known at all nationally. He was very popular within his division. But he lands in Sicily, sees what combat is like, realizes that's not the fate that he wants to face.
I didn't sign on for this.
And he has to find paper and ink, and he has to start doing cartoons and start up the newspaper to justify him being out of the front lines. So he scrounges for paper, for ink. He uses Sicilian wine mixed with used motor oil for ink to draw the cartoons at one point. He buys paper on the black market. He drives across the island of Sicily looking for somebody who could do an engraving of his cartoons.
For press.
Yeah, pulls zinc out of a coffin. I mean, this guy was this is really frontline cartooning, and the cartoons he did was about life on the front lines.
And what was going on.
Enormous sense of urgency to what he was doing in those years.
And the GIs responded.
Oh yeah.
Willie and Joe became very well known.
Oh yeah.
GI Joe.
Well, he was really one of the very few people who got away with exposing what life was really like.
But did he really get away with it? Would you like to have been summoned to Patton's office? Was he mad?
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of people did, you know, a lot of the higher ups didn't like what he was doing because he was telling a lot of truths that were very difficult. And the person who probably hated him most was General Patton. Hated him from the first time he saw the cartoons. I always say that from what I know of Patton, I don't think he really got the humor at all, but I think he knew he didn't like the look of these guys. Patton was a spit and polish general. He didn't like the look of Willie and Joe, these scruffy survivors, you know, with the
holes in their socks.
Yeah.
And same underwear for 10 days.
Right. Yeah. Patton expected combat soldiers to wear ties and have the top button buttoned in their foxholes.
But what happened to Patton when he tried to bring the guillotine down on this lowly little scraggly kid?
Well, the first time what happened is he saw these cartoons in the 45th Division News, Nobody outside the 45th Division ever saw these cartoons. Patton took a glance and said, went to the commander of the 45th Division, a general named Troy Middleton, and said, get rid of this cartoonist. And Troy Middleton said, I can't get rid of him. My men love him. They'll mutiny if we get rid of Bill Mauldin. And Patton said, I don't care. Get rid of him. And Middleton said, put it in writing, George. And George never got around to putting it in writing because he was soon embroiled in a controversy.
His own arrogance.
He had slapped a couple soldiers who accused him of malingering in a field hospital. And so Patton was extracted from the theater, and Mauldin was free to go and continue his cartooning career for a while. But they met again later in the war, Patton and Mauldin.
But didn't Eisenhower also step in and defend Mauldin?
Yes, and that was later in the war. That was in February 1945. What happened was Mauldin, by this point, was a true celebrity. I mean, by this point, Mauldin was rich and famous beyond his wildest dreams. He was syndicated in 200 papers in the home front. He would soon become the youngest Pulitzer Prize winner in history.
And be surprised he didn't even know what it meant when he opened the letter.
Didn't quite know what it meant, and thought it was some kind of honor, but didn't quite understand what a Pulitzer would mean to his career. And Patton was a national hero for saving the Battle of the Bulge. And so Patton was with his Third Army in Europe pressing against Germany, and Mauldin was still in Italy, but he decided he was going for the first time to visit France and see what life was like. He said he wanted to go to the Battle of the Bulge. I think he deliberately showed up late because he was sick of that kind of horrific.
Yes.
He had seen enough of that combat. But so he arrives in late January 1945, finds that the Battle of the Bulge is over. He has his own Jeep. He has his own passes. He decides he's going to drive to Paris just for a lark, go to the City of Lights for some sightseeing. And he arrives in Paris and is immediately arrested at a roadblock for being out of uniform. I mean, Mauldin looked even more eccentric than Willie and Joe.
Then.
He was wearing this fuzzy Russian-style fur hat that only members of the 10th Mountain Division wore. Somebody had given it to him. He didn't wear insignia. He wore his hair long. He probably wouldn't have shaved, but he didn't need to shave. He looked like he was about 15. He wore a tank commander's jacket. He wore paratrooper jump boots.
And he was driving his Jeep.
He was all out of uniform.
It had his name on the license
plate. Never wore
plate.
insignia. He's driving his own Jeep that has Lancia seats in it. He had tricked it all out. This guy was a free agent. He was a three-stripe sergeant, but he never wore the insignia. So the MPs thought he was a deserter who had stolen a Jeep and was trying to get into Paris. And he explained he could be a really arrogant kind of guy.
Really?
He explained to the MPs, I'm the great Bill Mauldin. And they pretended not to know who he was. He had done a lot of anti-MP cartoons, and there they were getting back at him. And they started to drive him to jail. And he convinces the MPs, take me to the Paris office of Stars and Stripes, the newspaper. The editors there will vouch for me. They'll explain everything. They delivered him to the office, and there the editors were waiting for Mauldin, and they said, yeah, just leave him here. We'll take care of him. Turns out just about every general in the theater was complaining to Stars and Stripes about Mauldin's cartoons. Charles de Gaulle didn't like his anti-French cartoons. General John Lee, who was the quartermaster-in-chief of Europe, he didn't like Mauldin's cartoons about the supply situation. And then just that day, General George S. Patton had contacted the offices and said, if you don't get rid of that cartoonist, I'm not going to distribute this newspaper to the Third Army. Now, Stars and Stripes at that time had the largest circulation of any newspaper in the world. More people read Stars and Stripes than any newspaper, and it was an Army newspaper. Patton's Third Army was a huge component of the American presence in Europe, and Patton was simply going to not distribute it because of the cartoons. So Eisenhower was concerned about this. Eisenhower liked Mauldin. Eisenhower also liked Patton. At least he liked what Patton could do on the battlefield. And he was concerned that Patton was going to get himself in some kind of controversy. And so he thought it would be a good idea, I don't know what he was thinking, to order a man-to-man, no-rank meeting between Bill Mauldin and George Patton.
And the dog. Patton's dog. Don't forget the dog. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, Patton's pet dog, Willie, the English
Right.
Bull Terrier.
And he reached out to pat him, and the dog almost bit him off
That's
his
right.
hand, and he thought, if he had bitten the hand off, Patton's problems would have been over with.
Yeah, Willie almost accomplished with one
Mhm.
snap what Patton was trying to do the hard
Mhm.
way, and that was ruin his cartooning career.
Mhm.
So Mauldin did drive 200 miles to the Ducal Palace of Luxembourg and had this meeting with George Patton, man to man. And Patton, of course, didn't keep it man to man. He didn't keep it no rank. He pulled rank right away, and he proceeded to lecture Mauldin for 45 minutes on the need for discipline and how insubordinate his cartoons were, and how he has to shape up and start being a good soldier. And then, and in fact, during the middle of this lecture, Patton pulls open a desk drawer. Mauldin leans over and sees that there's nothing in the desk drawer except for clippings of his cartoons. And that's when Bill realized this general is really obsessed with me. And Patton starts peeling off the cartoons and holding them with the tip of his finger and his thumb like they were contaminated and saying, what the hell are you trying to do with this cartoon except cause insubordination? So Mauldin was in a position where he had to defend his cartoons. And then Patton gave Mauldin 2.5 minutes to rebut. And Mauldin said, look, I've heard soldiers or officers say who like my stuff that what I'm doing is good for morale, is helping the men, that life is so hard on the front lines, especially if you're an enlisted man. It's a miserable existence. These guys have, this can only end badly for them. And nobody's airing their grievances. Nobody knows what it's really like. And I'm just trying to show the world what it is really like. And when they see their grievances expressed in cartoons, they feel a bit better about their situation. It validates them, and it gets them, it prevents mutiny. Patton had no idea what Mauldin was talking about and dismissed him. But Mauldin got the last word. He got the last word by, first of all, he brought to Luxembourg his friend, a man named Will Lang, who is the senior war correspondent for Time Life in Europe. And Will Lang was waiting in the Jeep when Bill got back. And Will Lang said, how did the meeting with Patton go? And Bill said, well, he gave his point of view, I gave mine. We didn't change each other's minds, but we parted good friends. And Will Lang said, can I use that quotation? And Bill said, sure. And that quotation appeared in the next issue of Time magazine.
Cool. You wrote the story so well, and I was mad that I didn't know anything about World War II. Thank you. The storytelling and the reality of the story was very educational to me. I recently had come under my father's medals.
Yes.
And there were 3 that we couldn't identify. I couldn't find them in any book. I found them in your book.
Really?
You said that they didn't know morale was low. They didn't. Yes, they did. You wrote how they issued medals like crazy. And they awarded them all over the theater because they wanted the guys to feel good about being there, to, strut a little taller. They really had no meaning, no value whatsoever. I have 3 of those medals.
Yeah. The medals that really meant the most to Mauldin, and actually for decades after the war, Mauldin didn't want to even look at medals.
Do you want to talk to the lead?
He had no interest in medals or ribbons. I think a lot of combat soldiers were that way. The war was so brutalizing that I think the medals and ribbons seemed kind of hollow. In fact, Mauldin's one of my favorite cartoons is Willie standing at a little aid station after he had gotten hit, and Willie says, just give me the aspirin.
I've already got a purple heart.
I already got a purple heart. Keep your stupid purple heart. Mauldin drew that after he was wounded. But I think later in life, and I found this to be true of many combat soldiers, the 2 medals that mean the most are the Purple Heart and the Combat Infantry Badge. Those are 2 medals that say, I was there. That's all they say. I was there. I was there in the hardest circumstances of the war. Very few, and most Americans today, I think, don't realize that during World War II, only 5 to 10% of American uniformed personnel were on the front lines doing fighting. 5, 10% at most. That this was really an unlucky minority who suffered almost unimaginable privations and terrors that other people were spared from. And Mauldin was really cartooning for that 5 or 10%. They were the Willie and Joes.
But that's what I mean, the story you told. How many times have I seen the landing of Normandy?
Yeah.
Never thought about those kids being seasick.
Yeah.
Never thought of them tumbling out and drowning
Yeah.
from illness before they even hit the beach.
Yeah.
The little nuances that you put in the story never dawned on me.
Yeah. It was
Wouldn't find
constant
them in
misery.
yeah,
It was constant.
was.
It wasn't just being under fire, which was terrifying beyond imagining, but it was the day-to-day, even when you weren't being under fire, surviving in mud. Mud so thick that it could tear the sole off your boot. Water constantly, and you're up to your knees in
Fungus.
water. Trench foot, you could lose your foot. Hunger. I never knew that combat soldiers on the front lines never really got enough to eat. Their rations were stolen.
The majority of the provisions were absconded with on the way to them and sold on the black market.
Yeah.
And they didn't get what everybody at home thought they were receiving because the trucks didn't come back.
Combat soldiers, certainly in Italy in 1943, 1944, suffered from they were malnourished.
Mm-hmm.
Their gums were bleeding. They didn't have the energy. They, compounding that with what was called battle fatigue, which is the psychological toll that.
And alcoholism. You know the joke about always drinking, but and you wrote it somewhere. The percentage of Americans that had alcoholism. Mm-hmm. More Americans died of alcohol poisoning from making their liquor and their. I didn't know that.
Again, see, this was an education for me. This was one of the great things for me, researching and writing this book, was understanding what life on the front lines was like in World War II. And one thing I hadn't realized before was that most soldiers on all sides, when they went into battle, were drunk if they could get drunk. But American enlisted men, at least, weren't issued a liquor ration, unlike the British or the Germans. So American enlisted men, the real Willies and Joes, really had to scrounge for alcohol. And many of Mauldin's cartoons deal with this attempt to acquire alcohol, to make it.
They made it out of aqua velva?
Yeah, to steal it.
I don't like alcohol, but I would like it even less made out of aqua velva.
Buzz bomb fluid. Yeah, this was nasty stuff. And Mauldin went overseas a teetotaler. His father was an alcoholic and didn't want to end up like that. But he found he could not go to the front lines, which is where he had to go to do his cartoons. He would go to the front lines for a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, live with the men, and then go to the rear and do the cartoons, and then go back. He found he couldn't go back unless he was drunk.
And when he went back, he had the same discipline that he had if he was in an apartment. He spent hours drawing the cartoon. If it wasn't on the right paper, if it wasn't the right color, he'd ditch it and have to go find more. The discipline with which he lived his life. And I love the story of the Jeep, which he requisitioned first from Ordnance, and he built a Harley Davidson. Yes. And because he and his brother and his father had always been tinkers, and he actually got it going, and it lasted, less than an hour before he hit a pothole and wrecked it.
Right.
So he requested a broken down, old, decrepit Jeep that he could fix up. And his popularity had, by now, of course, he had to fill out 3 tons of paperwork to get a Jeep, a dead Jeep.
Right.
And that's when he got the new Jeep.
Yes.
With all the papers and the passes to go through lines and everything, and afforded him the ability to go where he wanted to go with the men. He didn't have to hitch a ride. Yes. He didn't ask for permission. So it really gave him a passport to where he wanted to be to get the real stuff on it.
He was a free agent. He did what he wanted to do.
And he loved that Jeep?
He loved that Jeep. He put 30,000 miles on a brand new Jeep.
And what his father said was he was the first one in the family with a brand new car?
Yes. Yeah. He loved that Jeep. I think more than anything else he ever got in his whole life. General Mark Clark, who was the head of the Fifth Army in Italy, recognized how popular Mauldin was with the men, and he realized Mark Clark had to jump at the front of this parade, and so he made a very big show of granting the great Bill Mauldin his own Jeep that he could use.
With the license plate?
Yes.
And the paperwork?
And Mauldin really, that was a kind of affirmation that Mauldin had been seeking his entire life. And I think nothing he ever got the rest of his life meant as much to him. The transmission fell out the last week of the war, and of course he had to leave it overseas. But when he got back home, one of the first things he did was buy an exact replica of that Jeep in a showroom in Manhattan. And the family still has it today.
Good. Now we'll go back to the Jeep in a half an hour. But I loved when they flew him home, because the Army, of course, wanted him for PR. He was by now a celebrity.
Right.
But they couldn't fly him in this highfalutin plane because he wasn't an officer.
Yeah, he was a three-stripe sergeant.
So they made him a major.
A major general.
To ride in the plane, but only in the plane. And as soon as he set foot outside of it, somebody yelled, "Sergeant Muldoon, get over here."
Right.
The things they'll do.
Yeah.
And he hated the PR, didn't he? He hated the public appearance.
Yeah, he did. I think this is a complicated part of his character. He had survivor's guilt. His comrades, his friends, the men he had trained with for years in the 45th Division, they had all lived these hard scrabble lives from the Dust Bowl, where he had come from. Many of them were Choctaw Indians, Mexican Americans. He identified with them so closely. They were smart, they were fierce, they were educated, they were tough as nails. They had mentored him through training, through all those years, and he always cartooned for them. Then overseas, they all are destroyed by combat, and he is spared. He's spared because he's a cartoonist. And I think he never got over that guilt. He never got over the guilt, as he put it, of feeling that somehow he had made something good of a catastrophe, of a catastrophic situation. He had somehow made their suffering into the source of his wealth and fame. And that always haunted him. And so he was never
comfortable with it.
Never comfortable with being a
celebrity.
But
he was. He went on to Hollywood.
Yeah.
And he started to write.
Yeah.
And he hung out with Orson Welles,
yeah.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, it's amazing. He came home. It's 23 years old. He'd gone overseas, almost a $21 a month rifleman, completely unknown, impoverished. Came home a wealthy celebrity. I mean, he's home, and Eleanor Roosevelt wants to have tea with him. Orson Welles wants to meet him. Humphrey Bogart, it says, I'm so excited to meet you. I've always wanted to get to know you. And Mauldin is just overwhelmed with this kind of celebrity treatment.
And to go that instantaneously from combat, all Army, to high society falutinist,
yeah.
and still try to hold together the marriage.
Yes.
Which really hadn't been a marriage before he went away, and they had both lived so independently of one another.
He barely knew her. He barely knew his first wife.
She barely knew him.
Yeah, they barely knew each other. They, like many people after Pearl Harbor, they got married. They didn't know each other well. They got married after Pearl Harbor. He trained around the country with the 45th Division, was shipped overseas. She was pregnant when he left, and had a baby while he was overseas. So he came home to an almost 2-year-old child who he had never met, a wife he really barely knew, settled into a city he had never been to, Los Angeles.
Into a 9 to 5 routine, which he really never knew.
He had never had a job really outside the Army. And so he was expected to kind of take on life as an adult civilian, and he asked his syndicate, please let me out of my contract. I don't think I could handle cartooning. I need to learn how to be a civilian. And they wouldn't release him from the contract. And his life really fell apart. He divorced his wife. He started drinking heavily. He got into a big battle with his syndicate because he was doing very edgy, controversial cartoons about things like civil rights.
He came home in on that one, huh?
He came home eyes wide open. He had never thought about civil rights before, but here he can't believe that in a country that fought this war for democracy and freedom, that there are so many Americans who don't have civil rights.
And he thought he was on the lowest rung, being the runt, looking odd, not having laced doily credentials, and he found someone who was actually lower than him on the rung of life.
Yes.
And took worse swipes.
Yes.
Than he did.
Well, this is a classic Bill Mauldin. Anytime he ran across anybody who was aggrieved or an underdog, he championed their cause like you wouldn't believe. So Civil rights was a very natural issue for him. And this is 1945. There aren't many, I mean, in 1945, there's only one political party in the country who endorses civil rights for African Americans, and that was the Communist Party. The only one.
But he investigated it. He listened to what they had to say. Thank God he knew enough not to go into it whole
Right.
hog, but that's who he was.
Right.
He researched it.
But what happened was, because, if you're for civil rights in 1945, and the Communist Party is one of the few organizations kind of championing civil rights, inevitably you're going to get caught up with some communists. That's what happened to him, and he
Almost
was
paid
under
for it.
investigation for
Was he on his way to Korea or Vietnam when they
Korea.
denied but as a correspondent?
Yes, as a correspondent.
And so he filed for his papers, and he was denied because of his involvement.
Yes. J. Edgar Hoover took a personal interest in this issue and
who-
kept a file on Mauldin.
And who came to it wasn't Patton. I know it wasn't Patton.
No, it was Omar Bradley's
Yes, it was.
aide who came to his help, who now had a job in the State Department and got Mauldin clearance so he could travel to the Korean War, which he did.
And once he got there, he saw that he had made things different, didn't he?
Yeah, Mauldin, there's another thing I never knew, that there was so much controversy during World War II over the inequalities between officers and enlisted men that there actually was a congressional commission after the war to investigate how can we kind of decrease the inequality, within the Army and make the Army a better, more unified fighting force.
So it's
And
like-
Mauldin was a key witness to this commission. He
And
really
he couldn't
contributed
quite
to it.
believe it, but the longer he
Yeah.
was there, the more he saw these little nuances.
He found in Korea that it was a kind of kinder, gentler army than the one he had known in World War II, and he was very thankful for it, including racial integration.
And in the meantime, now he's publishing more and more books. He's also becoming a correspondent, as well as, and he's always in the right place at the right time, where a bomb is coming down on his head or they're blowing up something else.
Oh yeah, he had this incredible knack for inserting himself into crisis wherever it was around the globe. I mean, he's at Pleiku, at an air base at Pleiku in Vietnam when the Viet Cong attack. It's the first attack by the Viet Cong on American soldiers, February 1965. It pretty much begins the Vietnam War, and Mauldin was there. This stuff happened to him all the time. He found himself in the middle of riots all the time. He was a crisis-driven personality. I think he was drawn to crisis. And if there wasn't a crisis that he could go
Did he
to,
make it?
he would make one up himself.
Well, he did later on in life when he became a beatnik,
Yes.
when he started art, and I go back, I didn't realize it till you said it, but when he went to sculpturing.
Yes.
So the training that he got way back in the private art school
Yes.
would have led him into sculpture.
Yes.
And the first thing that he sculptured.
Was his favorite cartoon, which was there's no caption. It's a wonderful cartoon of an old cavalry sergeant, stripes up and down his arm, and with next to a Jeep with a broken axle, and he covers his face and takes his gun out
Shoots the
and
Jeep.
shoots the Jeep, just like a good old cavalry sergeant would do with
Yeah.
a horse with a broken leg.
Mm-hmm.
That was Mauldin's favorite cartoon. Mauldin was a real pro. He was a craftsman. He believed that the best cartoon communicated
Without words.
without words.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever he crafted a cartoon that didn't need a caption, he always loved it.
Loved it the
And he
most.
always felt this cartoon didn't get enough appreciation. So I think he drew it probably 4 separate times in his life and published it, trying to get the
People
recognition
to
for
catch
it.
it. I caught it immediately, and then he had it cast and gave it to about 250 friends, the little one.
Yes.
And after his death, the Legion and the veterans in New Mexico
Yes.
made a life-size statue of that sculpture in his memory.
And I believe, yes, it's in a
Park.
It's in a park in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
You know, I thought that was beautiful. The
Yes.
Jeep was with them. And yet, after Vietnam, after the beatnik, after he's living in Connecticut, hobnobbing with everybody, and he always had the Jeep.
Yes.
Oh, we missed all the airplanes.
Yes.
He did airplanes and with the same diligence.
Yes, I mean, this guy, he quit cartooning in 1948 and became an airplane pilot, a political activist. He wrote for Hollywood. He acted in a Hollywood movie, Red Badge of Courage. He did watercolors, did paintings. He ran for Congress.
Yes, that's
he went to
right.
Korea.
Yeah.
I mean, he kind of was a new journalist before his day. And then he got back into cartooning 10 years later in 1958, won
Wow.
his second Pulitzer Prize. I mean, this guy just kind of picked up.
I thought the most interesting one that I identified with was the script that he wrote and he sold. And it again was at a crucial part of one of the wars. And it wound up on a shelf. And we know it as the pilot to the original MASH movie.
Yes, the original script to Bill Mauldin's book up front is a real masterpiece. The original script. Mauldin was a consultant on it. It was written by Ring Lardner Jr. and John Lardner, two brothers, and true masterpiece. Mauldin was very reluctant to sell his book rights to Hollywood. He didn't want Hollywood messing up his book.
And you
He
make
said,
that understandable how hard it is to write a book, and it is like your child, as
Yeah.
you well know.
mm-hmm.
And then you sign it off to somebody else, and they put it somewhere where you never would.
The war was brutalizing and horrible, and he couldn't imagine. He didn't want a movie about war that had any humor, romance, or heroism. And Hollywood said, "Oh yeah, don't worry, we won't put that stuff in there." Paid him
Pittance.
Actually, it was the biggest book deal in history at the time. Paid him. I think he couldn't refuse the money. Assigned Ring Lardner Jr. to write the script with his brother, and they pulled it off. It's a magnificent script, way ahead of its time. I can't imagine it ever being done at that time. It's very grim, grotesque, kind of absurd humor. And Hollywood didn't make it. Ring Lardner Jr. was soon after investigated. He was one of the Hollywood 10. He did some time in prison for contempt of Congress. And so the script was put away. And Ring Lardner Jr. would revive much in the script for MASH. He was the writer for MASH.
Which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah.
And after reading the book, I can see how and why.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think Willie and Joe were kind of forerunners of the MASH movie and TV show.
And then he did his airplane things, and he hated the Air Force because he thought they were dandies in the upper echelon, and he couldn't believe he loved airplanes, and he did.
Yes.
And he loved tinkering with them, and he had to give them up. And then I thought, not even poetic justice, painful justice, working on his beloved Jeep, and it fell off the jack and crushed his hand.
Crushed his drawing hand. Yeah, boy, it took me a while to dig to this story. It is a very painful story, and it's a strange one. He was working on his Jeep, and a jack fell, and somehow it crushed his drawing hand. And that really ended his career. That happened in 1991,
That
I
had
believe.
to end a part of him.
And that it did end a part of him. And he was such a tortured character. I half imagine that he somehow did it on purpose or unconsciously did it on purpose. It was a strange accident to have, as was his ultimate demise when he scalded himself in a hot bath. As a cartoonist who did cartoons 6 days a week at some points in his career, he had this practice of submerging himself in a very, very hot bath, and he would stay in that bath until he emerged with an idea for that day's cartoon. And here he was.
Is that what you call hot stuff?
About 80, about 80 years old, and with Alzheimer's and an alcoholic, and he puts himself in a bath that's too hot, and he scalds himself with third-degree burns down his back.
But now he had married happily a second time, had another child, and divorced because he was a grumpy old man by then.
Yeah,
He was very hard to live with.
you're getting some of the wives confused.
Oh,
He
okay.
had 3 wives.
Oh.
He had the first wife he
I'm gonna
divorced
go
in
back and read the book
1945.
again. Okay.
First wife he divorced in 1945.
Okay.
Second wife, who and he had 4 children with the second wife, who dies in an auto accident in 1970. Third wife he marries in 1972 or so, and she was younger than 3 of his kids, and they divorce in the 1990s. She kicks him out of the house eventually, and then he is drinking very heavily, kind of living on his own in the desert, and his first wife, who he divorced in 1945, shows up on his doorstep and says, "I will take care of you," and she did until his last days.
God bless her.
Yeah.
God bless her. And I thought what was interesting, was it 2003 he passed?
Yes, January
Okay.
2003.
at Arlington, which is where he wanted to be buried, the highest ranking enlisted officer of the United States Army was presented the flag, and I couldn't figure out why. And then she, in turn, gave it to his 16-year-old grandson, which was proof positive that what he had said, dignity and respect for the enlisted men.
Yes.
There was now an office.
There is an office in the United States Army that's held always by a high-ranking enlisted man, a sergeant, whose sole job is to oversee the quality of life of enlisted personnel in the Army. And I dare say that office, which I think is so important, would not exist without Mauldin, without what Mauldin did in calling attention to the privations of the enlisted men.
And I wonder if the Bill Mauldins of today, going in the Army, would ever even realize there was a time without that dignity.
Right.
Without that respect.
Right.
So I think that the book should be mandatory reading for everybody who's going in the Army.
So it couldn't hurt. Certainly couldn't hurt, you know?
The cartoons are recognizable by the oldest generation, the greatest generation.
Yes. Yeah.
The next generation remembers seeing them here and there. I'm glad they're being republished.
Yes. Yeah, this is a collection of 700 of his it's a complete collection of his wartime cartoons, most of which have never been reprinted. There's a book called Bill Mauldin's Army that's kind of a greatest hits of his World War II cartoons, and that contains a couple hundred cartoons. This is 700, and I edited this because we discovered many of his original drawings from that era, and many drawings in the 45th Division News that nobody's ever seen, and it's amazing. These are all in chronological order to go through and see his development as an artist. I was going to say,
could you almost flip them like you do the old show in the Penny Arcade and see how he changed from pencil sketch
it's incredible.
to fat brush?
Fascinating. Fascinating to see the change of styles, the change in the characters. Joe is originally Joe Barefoot, a Choctaw Indian, like the other Native Americans he knew in Oklahoma in the 45th Division. And Joe eventually becomes this kind of grizzled character. I'm from Pittsburgh, so I imagine him as kind of Pittsburgh steelworker.
Yeah.
You know, but I think wherever you're from,
he's everybody's.
He's kind of an everyman, and because that's who he met overseas. I mean, you see the characters, the soldiers, mature, the wrinkles deepen, that the sadness in the eyes deepen, and it's all through the exposure to combat changes Mauldin and changes the cartoons dramatically.
And changes our world.
Changes our world, absolutely.
In his cartoons would be a historical pictorial.
Before Bill Mauldin's cartoons, the image that Americans had of their fighting men abroad was that their morale was always high, that they were always brave, they were handsome, they were kind of maybe rugged, but pretty spit and polish. And Mauldin showed an entirely different side, a side Americans had never seen before. And indeed, many Americans, when they saw Mauldin's cartoons in the newspaper for the first time in April 1945, they didn't like it. They didn't like what they saw. And they wrote to the editors saying, these aren't our boys. They don't look like this. They don't talk like this. You know, they don't cower in the mud when they're under fire. You know, they're not drunk all the time.
Wasn't there a quote when they were in Italy, 75% of American soldiers would have gone AWOL had it not been for the money going back home to their family, for the health benefits that their families needed, and they didn't have anywhere to go.
And they didn't want to abandon their friends in the line. Yeah, those are the reasons, yeah.
I can't tell you what a great experience it was reading it. Thank you.
Thank you.
For writing it. And you're much too young to be that smart. And the part that I love is the fact that you are young, and something of this age and this vintage and this historical value means that much to you.
Yeah, it was quite a shock that I really didn't know, and I was humbled by the fact that I didn't really know who he was. I wasn't aware of the cartoons and wasn't aware of the reality of the war behind the cartoons. I was humbled by the fact that, you know, here I am, a PhD in American history. I should know a thing or two but I really didn't.
That's how I felt.
I didn't
I
know
don't
it.
have a PhD.
I didn't know what the war was like.
Yep.
And
Yeah,
since then, I've gone out and given talks and have learned firsthand from people who were there about what the war was like. And it's been quite an education
Once
for me.
you open the can, you can see the sardines laying in the oil, but they're not going to come up to you and
Yeah.
tell you
Yeah.
how hard and how awful it was until you say, I know. You can tell me.
That's very true.
Yes.
What happens is I give my talk on Mauldin. I show the cartoons. I demonstrate that I understand the reality behind the cartoons.
Not only that, the respect.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
And then the veterans come up and they will talk to me because they do feel like I do understand.
But until then, you're an interloper.
Yeah.
You're too young.
Right.
You couldn't possibly
Right.
know. But now, having written it and communicated it as well as you did and meshed it, you meshed the cartoons well with the text, with the history, with the country. I mean, I can't get over how much more sense these little tidbits that I've seen all my life and I've known of. This put it together.
It brings it together.
It
Yeah.
does. It makes it understandable.
Yes.
It makes it comprehensive. And why they don't want to talk about it.
Yes. I feel, I tell my students, take a look at some of these cartoons. You'll learn something about what the war was like. I think you could get a real education by reading cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard to pass up,
Do they read them?
They do.
Didn't we used to get a knuckle slap by looking at comic books?
Yeah. Thankfully, that's changed a bit. Yeah. I mean, in Mauldin's day, cartooning was considered, déclassé art, low culture art form. But now, I think graphic novels and publishers like Fantagraphics Books that put this out, they have enormous respect for comics and for cartoon art. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a growing awareness that cartoon art is an art form and should be.
Historical documentation as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you know yourself, when you go looking for information, it's not recorded, is it?
Right.
There's a lot of oral history.
Yes.
But where is that picture? What paragraph was it? Did you read that in the local paper? Just give me a lead.
Yeah.
And as I tell my own children, whatever I write isn't necessary gospel.
Right.
I'm only getting references from people 100 years ago who believed they had all the information.
Yes. Yeah, you certainly cannot rely, when it comes to war, you can't rely on the official versions. The official versions deliberately leave a lot out.
No.
And what they usually leave out,
really?
What they usually leave out is the human experience, the human element. What was it like to be on the ground or in the air in combat? That's a reality that official versions have very little interest in relating, and to find an expression of that experience, you really do have to look at what's considered the low art forms, the comics, diaries, letters, oral histories, interviews.
What would we know about the caveman if we didn't have his cartoons off the cave wall?
Yes, there's something very primal and I think elemental about drawing. And I think that's what first drew me to Mauldin's cartoons, is there's a primal sense they're textured cartoons. You can almost reach out and feel the mud.
He knew that, though. That's what he was striving with.
The great Charles Schulz,
yes.
the creator of Peanuts. Every Veterans Day, he had Snoopy put on his garrison cap or his World War I flying ace outfit and go quaff a few root beers with Bill Mauldin. Charles Schulz worshipped Mauldin. Mauldin was Charles Schulz's hero, and Schulz always said that Bill Mauldin was the greatest cartoonist who ever lived. And once he had Snoopy say why, he drew great mud. And that's, when you look at Mauldin's cartoons, he drew great mud. You can almost feel it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
We're going to wrap it up. Is he going to be with you for the rest of your life?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I see the war in that generation with new eyes, and I think I see war in general with new eyes. Sure.
And the next project?
The next project is a history of the Seminole Wars in Florida. The Wars for Florida. It was our first counterinsurgency. It was our first guerrilla war. It didn't go well for the United States Army and never succeeded in evicting the Seminoles from Florida entirely.
Will you come back and talk to us?
I would love to.
I'm going to make sure I say your name right.
Todd Depastino.
Thank you very much. I needed that. The book is A Life Up Front, Bill Mauldin. Excellent, excellent. You can't not read it. You will enjoy it. You can borrow my copy anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us, and we will count on you coming back.
All right.